Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Did you have breakfast? Okay, then let's get an unstoppable kind of reply. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Fantastic. So this particular panel is called Unleashing Data Powerhouse for Africa's Digital Transformation. As we get into it and as we talk, we're going to make it a little bit more conversational, not just question and answers. And what we want to do as well is start off with a couple of data points for you to remember and some takeaways. And I'll give you a couple of them. The first one is 2.5 billion. Who can tell me what that data point is? Okay, because of time, I'll give you the answer. It is Africa's population in 27 years. 1 in 4 people on the continent are going to be in Africa, in the world are going to be in African, right? And then a third. Do you know what that data point is? By 2050, 1 in 3 people of working age are going to be in Africa. 1 in 3 of working age are going to be in Africa, right? And then 19. What is that data point?
Average age?
Absolutely. 19 is the average age of people in Africa, right? So when we're talking about data and what Africa is going to look like over the next 27 years or so, by 2050, it's really going to be about this potential of 1, population, and 2, the youth. So we cannot deny the impact that Africa is going to have in the world holistically. And so the things that we're going to be talking about is how do we leverage digital transformation to really enable us to achieve that. So with that, let me kick off with Jeff to just quickly introduce himself, and then we'll quickly go around the table.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm Jeff Wong, the Global Chief Innovation Officer for EY. So I have responsibility for a number of things, but not the least of which is our global labs and our advanced technology. So AI, blockchain, Web3, quantum, and robotics.
Thank you, Jeff. Niraj?
I'm Niraj Varia. I'm with iProcure. We digitize agro dealers in Africa to make sure that they're able to then get the essential inputs, the seeds, the fertilizer, et cetera, they need, that hundreds of millions of farmers in Africa need.
And Joy.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm Joy Basu. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs. What that basically means is I support the State Department and the US government in developing policy for our interactions with Africa. But the most exciting part of my portfolio is the economic and trade side, which is a real priority of this administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to actually have Joy on this panel because one of the things that we consistently do in private sector is really talk to ourselves, and we don't involve what the impact of government policies are. And you know, we cannot be able to do much without or in isolation of what government is. So my first question actually is to you, Joy. Innovation is so important in terms of diversifying African economies. What would you say is needed to help African innovation to really unleash that potential and stop making it potential and turn it to reality?
Yeah. Well, I would, you mentioned the importance of including government. I actually feel the same way in inverse, that in the government we often have conversations with ourselves, but I think particularly in the United States, it is the private sector that we need to work with to get anything done. I come from the private sector, and I really believe that, especially on the continent, it is this innovation, this entrepreneurship that will solve the problems of the communities and meet consumers' needs. So I think that, drawing off your opening, there are 2 things I think are necessary. One is human capital development. I believe, Africa is a continent that is highlighted for so many resources, but its greatest resource is its people. And that is really exciting, and I think the talent on the continent is what makes it unstoppable. And we need to invest in great education, not just traditional K through 12, but we need, traditional school can't be the only ways in which we educate going forward. The ways of the past cannot be the only ways we think about going into the future, because the problems we face are multiplying, and we need, the talent to be thinking inside and outside the box. The second thing I would say is we really need to think about infrastructure, and that is where government, both the US and in partnership with African governments, really need to be investing. Those are the sort of public goods that we can't rely on individual companies to always be doing, but we as the public sector need to be creating those public goods. And when I say infrastructure, I mean traditional infrastructure, roads, et cetera, but also digital infrastructure. And then the third thing is, and this is again coming from where I sit in the government, is really working on an enabling environment in which companies and entrepreneurs of all sizes can create the solutions that they see, using their talent on that infrastructure to really not only solve problems, but create opportunities.
No, that's really fantastic, as I take it from you, it's skills, basically human capital, infrastructure, as well as an enabling environment which is driven by policy.
Yes.
That's a fantastic thing. Speaking of that, I will have to make this plug because it's a fantastic read. You should all look at Digital Sprinters, which really looks at the impact of digital transformation and actually goes a little bit deeper on some of those key elements. And the last point on that is also technological adoption, which takes me to the next question, Jeff, and this is for you. EY has been instrumental in driving innovation globally. What specific strategies are you looking at deploying in Africa to help see digital transformation on the continent?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. First, just to react to your first question, I need to emphasize the education comment, Joy, that you made. What's really amazing is if you look at entrepreneurship, a small group of people can have an outsized impact, and particularly around advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, sort of the cool buzzwords of today. What you see is there's a lot of education that is broadly available, that's made broadly available, and I would highly encourage the policymakers to make sure you're encouraging your youth to get involved in particular in those technologies, because I think they're incredibly important. But in terms of what EY is doing, we, like many large companies, global companies of the world, recognize this amazing potential, Charles, that you talked about at the beginning. And so we're doing a series of different innovative investments into different platforms that utilize advanced technologies and data from Africa in order for us to sort of move the world forward. And I'll stick in sort of the ESG realm. So one thing we've done, this is relatively simple, is we've invested in a platform that helps companies measure their carbon and other of those types of things that you need to measure output from an ESG perspective. It's early, it's simple, it's straightforward, but what we recognize that to make change, you have to measure and you have to know where your baseline is. So we're started with that. On a more fun element, or in the cooler technology aspect, we've also invested in different blockchain technologies and platforms that allow us to do things like measure other aspects of ESG. So in particular, for emerging and developing markets, in the forced labor aspect of it. How are companies and supply chains reporting up through the system to make sure that they're honest and good, and then using the blockchain in environments where you need a different level of trust amongst the different players in that ecosystem. So those are just a few ways that we're doing it. But I'll tell you this, like we make, since I own the labs in AI and blockchain and all the different technologies, we make sure that when we have these technologies, we make these investments, that we globalize them. And in particular, that means making sure we're bringing our solutions and assets beyond what I just described to Africa to make sure that we are enabling the entire world.
Absolutely. And I want to stick on that piece around ESGs, and Niraj, as I move on to you, because you work very closely with small-scale holders, and I would love for you to actually tell the audience here a little bit more about iProcure and some of the innovative things that you're doing to help small-scale holder farmers. Because again, when we're talking about digital transformation, that element of technological adoption is critical. But we always think about technological adoption perhaps at a very highbrow base, but yet in terms of SDGs, food security, you're doing exactly that. So how are you doing it to enable those small-scale farmers?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with kind of some high-level numbers that everybody, or high-level statements that everyone here, I'm sure, has heard 20 times this week. Africa is food insecure. Africa has the potential to feed itself, and Africa has the potential to feed the world.
Yes.
We've heard that many times. What does that actually, why doesn't that happen today, right? And one of the core challenges the African smallholder farmer has, and this is where most of the farming happens, it's all rain-fed, it's all very marginal. One of the core challenges they have is they don't use enough agricultural inputs. Certified seeds, hybrid seeds, the right crop protection, and so their yields are a fraction of what they could be. And what they do, therefore, is they deplete the land, then they move on to the next patch of forest, chop it down, they start again. And we're stuck in this cycle, which makes the whole thing worse. So our mission is to make sure those farmers have access to those essential inputs so that they can get the yields that they should be getting. And they are then able to sell into the market, and Africa can then, in time, feed the world. The reason why they're not able to get those inputs is a data problem. Very simply, that is what it is. They're pen and paper businesses, micro businesses. The guys they're buying their seeds and fertilizers and so on from are small-scale pen and paper businesses. The entire chain is a bunch of micro data silos. Some pen and paper, some get into Excel. But essentially, nobody knows what's happening. So if you want to know what inputs people are using, nobody knows. The biggest companies in the world have no idea. The smallest guys on the continent have no idea. And our solution to that is we digitize that front line. So all of those agro-dealers that the farmers are buying their seeds, etc., from, we digitize. We've developed in Kenya a piece of software which essentially is a full-scale retail ERP system, but designed for that local micro business. We've digitized 25% of agro-dealers in Kenya. We've digitized 10% of agro-dealers in Uganda. What that allows us to do is we use those millions of data points to provide inputs on credit to those agro-dealers. So 15% of agro-dealers in Kenya last year got inputs on credit from us, reducing their working capital strain. We provide that data to local banks and fintechs to provide further lending to those agro-dealers. We also are able to use that network, that platform, as a way for third parties who want to, for example, lend to farmers to help the farmers validate their loans. So instead of me sending Jeff a loan and Jeff spending it on beer, I can now send, or a fintech can send Jeff a voucher, which is only allowed to be used against seed and crop protection and fertilizer of these brands. He takes it to Joy's agro dealer. Joy validates that in her system, hands over the product, and our system lets the fintech know that this transaction has happened. So it massively de-risks farmer lending, which will increase the amount of money that farmers can borrow.
Yes.
I could keep going, but that network, manufacturers are using it to get insights as to what's selling on the ground. They're using it to improve access to novel products, which is critical as we try and move away from chemical straits, because they can now issue vouchers for discounts against their new products, which are redeemed through the network. And it's not expensive, I'll be honest. It costs us about $2 million to get to 25% of a country's agro-dealers, on average, right? Nigeria would be a bit different, but by and large, that's what it takes. And 25%, I keep saying that, that's the magic number at which the network effects take over, right? That's when the fintechs and the banks and so on want to get involved.
Yes.
So that's broadly what we do and how we use, and all the decision making essentially is data driven.
Absolutely. And I think you've spoken about the $2 million to get that, but I was going to say it's absolutely fundamental, because when we think about the continent, we're talking about 54 in some cases. Some people will say 55 countries. It's a debate we can have over coffee later. But at the end of the day, you've spoken about Kenya, you've spoken about Uganda. How can we get to the 54 countries? Because we are primarily an agriculture-based continent. Yeah. What would it take?
It's a great question. I mean, for our solution and for many of the solutions of others around us, once a system is working, across Anglophone, it's a matter of taking it there.
Yes.
There's a bit of mobile money integration, right, to be done, and depending on the country, depending on the regulatory environment, that's 2 weeks to 2 months. And then it's just about acquiring those customers.
Absolutely.
For Francophone, there's a bit of work to be done, right? We've got to change the language libraries, not a lot to be done. There's more design work to be done when we get into the Arab-speaking countries, but it's very scalable.
You're saying it's doable in essence.
I'll give you an example. We were at 0 in Uganda May last year.
Wow.
Okay.
Today we're at 10% of Uganda.
Fantastic.
For Burundi, we didn't make an effort. One of our Ugandan clients, partners, said, you know what, we have stores in Burundi, can we take it? We said, here you go, off you go. And we now have data coming in for Burundi, and all they did is just put a new SIM in. So it is very scalable once it's working. That's kind of one piece, somebody needs to go and do it. The second piece is, it takes time to build the partnerships.
Yes.
To get them excited about and believe in what we're doing.
Okay.
You know, whether there's government partners to use the technology and the platform to distribute subsidized products, or the banking partners to provide credit.
Yes.
That all takes time. But you know, our experience is, again, once we start telling the story early, once we hit the roughly quarter of all agri-dealers, they want to jump in.
That's fantastic. Jeff, I want to come back to you and sort of build on some elements. And what he's really talking about is that element of tracking and providing that value chain. Where do you see blockchain specifically providing value to de-risk a lot of the challenges that we have? And not just on the farming side, but some of the other elements that are required, whether it's certification of medicines, for instance, on the continent, and having the right medicines to patients, etc. How do you see that tying in?
You know, blockchain, first question for the audience, how many people are familiar with blockchain as a technology? I think I'm getting a reasonable number of nods and hands in the audience. That's great.
Okay, we can do a 30-second high-level blockchain for non-tech.
Yeah, basically it's a way to have trust in a database because no single entity owns that database. It's spread out across. Now, I'm way oversimplifying for Charles, but it's the easiest way to conceptualize it, right? Because there's all sorts of fanciness of how you verify it, et cetera, which is down to the technical details. But allows you to put trust into a system where trust didn't exist before, and you don't have a central authority that you're comfortable either defining that level of trust, or the group doesn't really want to have a central authority in general. And so it's trust without a central authority saying, whether the government or a company saying, I put trust into the system. And this is what you're describing is really important across all of Africa and frankly, different parts of the emerging markets in the world, because there are different varying levels of trust with the institutions that exist inside those environments. So the most important ones would be food, pharmacy, things like that. But we're also seeing broadly verification. So in the food world, we do verification of where something came from, right? Yes. So you can go all the way back to the farm and say, this came from this farm, was processed in this facility, and now hit this shelf in the grocery store. And we're able to track. There are examples around the world where we're able to track that. You can see exactly why, from a pharmaceutical perspective, that would be incredibly important, because you want safety and security into your pharmaceutical systems, et cetera, et cetera. You can also do it for things that are well written about, but we don't see as much of, which is ownership, right? So ownership of land, houses, different assets, right? Do you verify that ownership? Because perhaps the central authority where you are isn't so the central authority you want verified in. Yes. It's a really, really interesting technology that's evolving very rapidly. And I think that there were a lot of privacy security questions at the beginning that are being addressed at the enterprise level. So we're seeing more and more full supply chains or any supply chain networks adopt this technology. I think it's a particularly one that's interesting and important, particularly when you're starting to talk about agriculture,
Yes.
which is one of the big important issues of the day. Just to touch on really quickly, the way I look at it, Rajan, and apologies if I'm overstepping into your space, is that the technology, from the seed technology to the watering to the fertilizer technology, that exists to feed the world.
Indeed.
And the optimizations of the supply chain exist to get that food to the right places in the world. But the thing that underlies it is needing the data.
Indeed.
And if we can do that, then you can achieve this vision on, again, a relatively small number of people, small number of companies doing the work you're doing, will enable you to feed sort of Africa, but indeed the world.
Indeed.
Charles, can I add one point to that? Just an example, very
Keep
quickly.
it short.
To that, when we expand into Uganda, the first question farmers ask us when they meet us for the first time is, are your products counterfeit or genuine?
Exactly.
It is the fundamentally most important point across many of these countries because the supply chain doesn't work.
Yes.
Blockchain traceability solves that.
It definitely does. And there's so many elements. Like I mentioned, medicine, also land ownership is also a big challenge. And so being able to actually track all of that is absolutely important. I'll twist this a little bit and just prepare you all. I would love to get one question from the audience, but I'll first go to Joy and ask this. When we're thinking about government, it's definitely central. I know Jeff mentioned about a single central authority. We know government is that. But I want to ask, how does the US government look at partnerships, especially in your role, with African governments to help solve, for me, I would like to dwell on two things: education, because it's fundamental, and then secondly, infrastructure. Are there some programs that you can speak about that we are currently thinking about that can help Africa at the moment?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think that we could go into a whole conversation on smallholder farmers that I'm resisting, but maybe that'll be, again, over coffee, about 55 countries and 54 versus smallholder agriculture. But I would say on education, and infrastructure, there are a lot of programs that we're trying to start. One is something we've launched with a lot of the companies called Digital Transformation with Africa. Yes. And it was announced in December at the US-Africa Leaders Summit. And I'd encourage you all to look it up online. In the sake of time, I won't give all the details, but it is our effort to have partnerships directly with African governments, but also with nonprofits and companies through our programming and through our policy to really create an internet in Africa that is open, accessible, and secure. And again, that goes to the infrastructure, soft and hard, that we were talking about, but that is a huge priority of the president. Second to that, there's another program that the president and the G7 are leading called the PGIs, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, in which digital is a core element of that partnership. And this is thinking about the infrastructure that we need in the next century, but thinking about how you fund that. Obviously, there are models in the world, particularly in Africa, that we see where foreign governments are really giving loans and financing infrastructure. And we've seen there are some challenges when it comes to the services that communities get and the human rights that are associated with that. So PGI is an attempt to really aggregate funding for private companies alongside these governments to make sure that this infrastructure is serving the people, that is serving those communities, and that it's built in a fair and sustainable way. I could go on about those two things, but in the interest of time, please either catch me afterwards or, thanks to the internet, you can find out more about both DTA and PGI.
Great. Question from the audience? One question only.
Once the farmer can't harvest the corn, everything else fails.
Absolutely.
The blockchain, the digital tracing, and everything else is completely, unhelpful. So,
Fantastic.
if it is possible for them to make a comment on that, and I would also love to have a chat outside there to see how we can join forces.
Thank you so much for that question. In fact, I'll use this as the closing statement from each one of us. So I'll start with you. How does climate change impact digital transformation in Africa? And also wrap up with your closing comments.
So I definitely think that there's an opportunity, right? I think the carbon credit marketplace or those types of marketplaces to put value into people who are doing things in a clean and honest and fair way, I think will really provide the possibility of putting value back into the hands of the people who are doing things in an honest, right way. I also think from an advanced technology perspective, the newer models, particularly in artificial intelligence, will allow us to seek new advances in climate change efforts, sort of direct us to what is more effective, probably, or potentially more effective, direct us to things that are impacting the world negatively, maybe more than we thought. So I like the idea of using artificial intelligence, the more advanced tools and math basically associated with it, to help us learn more about what we could be doing that's better.
Thank you, Jeff. Niraj?
Oh, climate
Closing
change.
comments as well.
Yeah, climate change and smallholder farmers. We should have several coffees later. There are certainly positives and negatives to this. The traditional way of farming, it's a real challenge for farmers because they're used to doing one thing in one way. And we're already seeing farm sizes shrinking, yields degrading, etc. So it's very much a challenge. However, when you get down to a more micro level, there are great new hybrid seeds. There are great new varieties of crops. There are also you can also shift farmers from maize to wheat in certain areas, or other appropriate crops. So more groundwork, more supply chain work can shift them into more productive crops and farming techniques, which is better for them and better for everyone. But it's hard graft, right? We've actually got to do the work to make that happen. In closing remarks, I'd say it's really exciting to be here, but don't think of me as me. Think of me as representing. There are thousands of me's in Africa who are building businesses like ours across the sectors. And by 2050, when we have 2.5 billion,
yes,
it's going to be those companies using homegrown technology to solve homegrown problems who are going to be the giants.
And that's why Africa is unstoppable, right?
There we go.
Joy?
Indeed. 3 quick thoughts. One, I think, it's a great question, and you're right, nothing else matters if we don't live on a habitable planet. And so we need to find ways to make that challenge an opportunity for Africa, right? The challenge of population needs to be an opportunity for Africa. The challenge of climate needs to be an opportunity. So I would think about it in 2 ways, both from a adaptation perspective. How do we think about using both digital and other technologies to solve these problems, right? How do we not follow the same energy curves that we've used in the West, but using Africa's assets, green assets, to really power this digital transformation on the continent and around the world. From a mitigation perspective, I can't help but thinking for small farmers, how do we get them that information at a lower cost so that they can make decisions about their small businesses as small farms? And how do we think more quickly about affordably delivering that information so they are empowered to respond? I think we need to be thinking about it from both sides, but it's a really important question. And third point in conclusion is, I'm just so grateful to be in this room and with not only the 3 of you, but with everyone here, because so often the narrative about Africa, particularly this week, can be about the hard things, the political instability, the coups, the currency. But I think everyone in this room and everyone on the stage sees the unstoppability of this continent, the people, the potential. So thank you for being a part of that team together. We are the ones who will make that, the reality with the 2.5 billion people who are coming. And so I just think it's incredibly important to have this conversation and remember the power and the potential and the excitement, and make sure that that potential is reality.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And in closing, I just want to summarize some of the key things that I think came out of this. One is that Africa is unstoppable because of the data points. 1 in 3 people by 2050 who are going to be of working age are going to be in Africa. 1 in 4 people in the world by 2050 are going to be in Africa. The numbers speak for themselves. We just need to ensure that we are stopping to talk about potential and realize that potential, make it a reality, especially for those people who are underserved, underprivileged, and also really looking and leveraging digital transformation to go beyond the major cities on our continent. Because actually most of the population that we have is in remote parts and not the urban population on the continent. And then lastly, I want to talk about the three things that Joy mentioned. Human capital. We must really ensure that we're building the right foundation from an early childhood perspective. Nutrition, which is what Niraj spoke about, is central to that. We've seen the data that children between 0 and 7, if they don't have the right nutrition, whether you give them the best education and educational programs, they can't learn, right? When I said hello to all of you, I think you were slightly hungry, but you were not responding. And yet you ate. Imagine a child who hasn't eaten, right? So we need to ensure that we're feeding our children. We can't talk about education without nutrition. And then secondly, infrastructure. I'm going to take on Joy in terms of the partnership with the US government to see how do we really get more African countries connected digitally, the backbone, fiber optics, etc., because digital transformation needs to be a right. And then last but not least, ensuring that we're continuously working with government to get the right enabling environment to drive that digital transformation, to build all of those small companies so that we can employ our people. With that, thank you so much and hope to see you soon.